Welcome to this live recording of a lecture by Dr. Douglas Baker. This tape is one of a comprehensive series of lectures covering virtually every aspect of ancient wisdom and esoteric teachings. For further information about these and other works by Dr. Baker, please write for a catalog. Since the beginning of recorded history, references have been made to an ancient continent called Atlantis, a continent that met with a catastrophic end. In this lecture, Dr. Baker considers what is known about this lost continent in the teachings of ancient wisdom and relates this to modern scientific knowledge concerning the drifting continents, plate tectonics, and global geology.
The surprise about the lecture this afternoon was that I was the one in for the surprise. And the surprise was that I decided to build my lecture mainly around the subject of Atlantis this afternoon. We have been going so deeply inwards that I thought it was time that we started to spread out laterally or outwards, and to grasp in our consciousness the fact that the world has changed significantly over vast periods of time, which, however, are not so vast that we have not been able to cram in 200 or 300 lives in the interim period of about 16 million years. So we're looking at a matter that goes back about 16 million years. Today there has been the greatest Dunkirk in occult history. You perhaps don't know what Dunkirk was, except for the fact that its name has been applied to the exodus of evacuees from Cuba at the present moment. The thousands of people who are leaving Cuba are coming over here in small boats. Well, the whole of the British Expeditionary Force was evacuated from Europe in those same sort of small boats. And it was a great miracle. And so it's a polite way of talking about retreat, which the British have never liked to use, the word retreat. Just as the Americans don't ever like to mention the fact that the British burnt Washington in 1812. We all hear about the War of Independence. This is not a time of rubbing in salt into old wounds. The matter of Dunkirk is a polite way of saying that the British had to get out of Europe and quick. But there is a Dunkirk going on at the moment, and it is the old established order of theosophists and of the many other esoteric groups as well, who have long supported the contention that a huge subcontinent existed in the space between North America and Europe. This space now being occupied by the Atlantic Ocean. And many of the esoteric teachings are based on the proposition that there was a continent in the mid-Atlantic millions of years ago, and that this continent provided a refuge and home for the Atlantis concept of a root race, the fourth root race out of 7, and we are in the 5th. And this continent or subcontinent provided a cultural experience which enabled mankind to open up its solar plexus chakra. By that we mean open the solar plexus chakra to influences from the world of emotion, from the attis of, or under the stimulus, I should say, of this opening solar plexus chakra. The Atlanteans produced a glittering civilization, a glittering civilization. It was brash, it was something that still startles every one of us when we view remnants of this culture to be found still in South America, and where the Mayan and Aztec civilizations that are just pale reflections of Atlantis still harbor these cultural relics. Now the matter of Dunkirk has arisen because science has focused its attention in very recent years to the exploration of the beds of the ocean, very recently, in the last 2 decades or less. And so the matter of the structures of the floor of the ocean floors is now scientific public knowledge. And according to those who have examined the scientific evidence, there appears to be no evidence of a lost continent of Atlantis, and hence the Dunkirk. The group, or the groups, of occultists who are suddenly going all silent about Atlantis and reviewing their previous opinions, take no heed of the fact that many of the teachings on Atlantis were initiate teachings. They were given out by a group of initiates. And that if they are going to reject these initiate teachings, then there's nothing left. There's no basis for the esoteric sciences whatever. And all the other science aspects of the esoteric sciences will have to be reshaped in the light of this new scientific evidence. About 30 years ago, when I became interested in the esoteric, there was a similar shift of opinion. The investigation of science showed that the interior of the atom could not possibly be anything like Leadbeater described it. Leadbeater said all the atoms were different, all the elements were different, the atomic nuclei were different. And he depicted dumbbell structures, he depicted glorious different shapes for the center of the various elements, the atoms of the various nuclei of the various elements. And so there was a Dunkirk. Occultists who had great faith in the teachings of Besant and Leadbeater began to shift ground. But of course, science went on further and found that they were wrong. That the nuclei of the various elements are not hard and fast structures made out of protons and neutrons in different combinations. We now find that science is shifting ground and is talking about things like quarks and all kinds of energies associated with these quarks. And I suppose before long it will emerge what has been patent to me for all these years, that Leadbeater was right. That the structure of the nucleus of the hydrogen atom is two interlaced triangles oscillating on each other. We'll see. Meanwhile, there's been a Dunkirk there and there's another Dunkirk now, merely because science has new views on the ocean floors. The esoteric proposition was that there arose 2 subcontinents and that they were highly unstable. They were in the north a continent that was not much smaller than Australia, and I have done this investigatory work myself and seen the structure of this island subcontinent and heard the cries of its people as it progressively broke up and sank below the level of the seas. Before this occurred, there had also been another subcontinent in the South Atlantic, and this had broken up very quickly. and sunk below the waves. There is, of course, a mid-Atlantic ridge which has been plotted very carefully. And there is evidence then that there is a rise or a mid-Atlantic ridge, and this was said to run through the old civilization of Atlantis. The final upheaval which submerged Atlantis was about 10,000 years ago. It was mentioned by Plato. And it was said that the Atlantis continent lay beyond the Pillars of Hercules, making it quite clear that it was not within the Mediterranean, a known region of the old world, but that it lay beyond the great Rock of Gibraltar out in the Atlantic Ocean. Today there is nothing left visible except the islands of the Azores Islands, which are volcanic mountains still above the water. And they were part of Atlantis. At this stage I must mention also that there was part of the Atlantic ridge, that part of the Atlantic ridge called Iceland. And Iceland is still there. A testimony to the fact that the ocean floor bed can be pushed above the water, because it is part of this mid-Atlantic ridge. Now the occult teachings always said that Atlantis was unstable. I'm going to now deal with, I'll tie it all up later, I now want to deal for a moment with the crust of the earth. For here the scientific arguments are founded on the nature of the crust of the earth. This is the sea, shown here, and the structure of material under the sea is different from the structure of material under the land masses. So we can put the sea here, and we can show that the land masses, like North America and Europe, lie as a granite crust for a depth of about 30 kilometers. This granite crust lies only where there is a landmass. Only where there is a landmass. Beneath it is a basaltic layer, which we see here, a basaltic layer. And this basaltic layer, unlike the granite, lies under the ocean as well. So this is the essential difference between continental masses, which have a granite layer, and the ocean bed, which has no granite layer. Now that has been very carefully confirmed by science. There is another immensely important teaching which has been emphasized by science. About 70 years ago, a very clever German, Wegener, said that all the continental masses were once one. All of them were once one. That the Earth's surface was concentrated into one region, and that there were no other large continental areas at all. And according to this very, very rude person who upset scientific theory, according to him, the continents like North America, let's pop Florida in there as a tribute to our Rose here, that the continents of North America and South America split off from this great single landmass and began to move away. And so there arose the concept of the drift of the continent, that the continents floated about 7 centimeters a year. And when you're talking about 200 million years, the 7 centimeters can easily produce the width of the Atlantic Ocean. And so this granitic crust layer floated over the basaltic layer, and the continents drifted apart into their present positions. And his proposition was laughed at by science, scorned. It tried to establish itself in the late 20s again and went out. And I was told, as I have frequently reminded you, that the moon came out of the Pacific Ocean, that part of the earth bulged and a passing solar force dragged part of the earth out and formed the moon. Today it sounds absolute nonsense, but I was taught it at school. As I always say, I went to a damned expensive school. So we will forget the fact that the Pacific was once the moon. And we come now to the movement of continents away from a central mass. Science would have nothing of it. The scientific proposition was that the changes in the Earth's contours, the contours of the continent, was up and down, like that. That occasionally the granitic layer, or whatever you like to call it, the crust, moved upwards, and so we had the birth of continents, and occasionally it moved down. And this was the tendency everywhere on the earth, that if this went up, that went down, and you got a change in the shape of the continent. But very recent scientific expertise, which is centered upon the ability to take magnetic soundings from the floor bed of the oceans, sailing a ship over it, this evidence points to a support of Wegener's theory. And so, just as we have a Dunkirk in occult circles, so there is a Dunkirk in the world of geology and in scientific circles. And increasing evidence shows that indeed the continents seem to have drifted apart round about as long ago as 150 million years, and as shortly ago as 20 or 30 million years. And so since that theory of the drift of the continents and an examination of the magnetic structure of the floors of the seabeds, everything's gone quiet in the occult world. No person dare rear his head and say, "Boo" to science. So there's a great shift of ground, silence and shift of ground, while people tiptoe very quietly to the other side of the room. We don't hear much about the initiate teachings anymore. Well, I stand by them. I stand by them, and I make my voice clear and loud, that they're valid. Now, having said that, I'm going to now read a paper to you, and I won't make it hurt. It's one that I wrote not so long ago, because somebody, a very erudite person, put these matters to me, taunting the ancient wisdom. In fact, he's quite a nice person, but he was still taunting the wisdom, and he said to me, "You should know the answers to these questions. How can you support the contention that there was an Atlantis?" There couldn't have been an Atlantis, because they're examining the floor bed of the Atlantic Ocean, and they find that their magnetic soundings show quite clearly that the floor bed of the Earth has not been disturbed. There is a strip of magnetic material there and there. There is another differently magnetized region there and there. And it's quite clear that there has been no fracturing of the floor bed significantly. And therefore there couldn't have been a subcontinent there anyway. You see, the Earth's magnetic field changes slightly. North Pole is never fixed. It moves around quite considerably. And as it moves around, the Earth's magnetic field moves with it. And therefore the rocks that are being born, are impregnated with magnetism. And as they're born, their molecules take up a magnetic direction. And according to this theory then, and others, the growth of the continents has been as the result of something going on here in the region of the mid-Atlantic ridge. I'm excluding the Pacific here. And it is the proposition of these teachers that if this is North America, or these scientists, I say, there's North America, and there is Europe, and here is the Atlantic, that in the mid-Atlantic ridge, immense forces have been driven upwards from the center of the Earth, and that these forces propel the material, which we call the basaltic layer, outwards. The basaltic layer keeps moving outwards. By that we mean part of it towards Europe and part of it towards America, and thus the continents drift apart. The continents thus drift apart. And when they move out, they are moving at 7 centimeters a year, and as the Earth's magnetic field changes, then the different registrations of the magnetic alteration is found in the ocean floor bed. So they have a case. Now, my own personal investigations into the matter of Atlantis are summed up in what I'm about to say here. The climate of Atlantis, and this isn't in the paper, was about what it is this afternoon here in this room, which is about 75 degrees Fahrenheit, and it is very similar to that of Hawaii, which is never much more than 2 or 3 degrees either way. So we're talking about a continent now that existed, put it in again, in between North and South America. It was very like Australia and therefore had quite a few indentations, especially a ridge that came out here, including the Azores. And it was a very flat and low-lying area, And I'm going to just point out to you now that it lay still in the region of what we call the Gulf Stream. The Gulf Stream moves across the Atlantic and keeps Europe fairly mild. The lovely warm waters of the Gulf Stream today keep Europe mild. But what must have been the condition in those early days when this land mass was there and the Gulf Stream with its warming energies couldn't get to Europe? Those are the sort of questions that you have to bear in mind. Well, here are my observations. Atlantis was a region of the ocean floor that for variable periods of time and extent was exposed above the seas where it weathered. So this is my contention, that the floor of the seabed moved upwards, and where it was exposed, it weathered. This exposure, may I go to the extent of another drawing here, and this is why I chose this subject this afternoon and not others, because we have enough drawing space here. Here's the Atlantic Ocean, and here was Atlantis, low-lying, and every now and again there would be volcanic upheavals which would create mountainous structures of volcanic material. The weather, like the rain and the wind, acted upon these structures, and a lot of it moved down into the valleys. And so this is my proposition, that Atlantis was a low-lying structure, very unstable, and perforated here and there by volcanic mountains, of which the Azores Islands are a remnant. The main area of the inhabited part of Atlantis was subtropical. My memories, going back to previous lives, even including the kind of ships that we reached Atlantis in, was that it was subtropical. It was low-lying. There were many mangrove swamps. there were tides that would inundate great areas, and one year part of the land would be above the sea, and then it could quite easily disappear. And this matter made Atlantis a maritime nation. It was a maritime nation. Let me go on and illustrate as I go. The main area was subtropical, and it was not much more than the basaltic layer of most ocean beds. And so all Atlantis was a bit of the basaltic layer sticking up above the water. And it contained no granite, no granitic layer that I described earlier. Here it became covered by sedimentous and other volcanic material and the byproducts of weathering. Atlantis was thus perched on the crest of the then mid-Atlantic ridge. It was always unstable from 8 million years ago right down to 10,000 years ago. Elements of old Atlantis have moved both east and west from these ridges. I showed you earlier that in the mid-Atlantic there is an upheaval of land that parts and moves towards Europe and towards North America. Atlantis was perched right on top of it, perched right on top of this upward upheaval or movement of new rock, and naturally it was being rent the whole time, just like Iceland is today. In Iceland, you can see the volcanoes, and acres of material are pushed above the sea that you can actually watch. And so this was what Atlantis was like, except that it was such a gorgeous climate. It was right in the middle of the Gulf Stream. It was low-lying. It was just like the South Pacific Islands are, which we have none of in the Atlantic Ocean today, but that's what Atlantis was like. And it began to move in both an easterly and westerly direction under the impetus that I've described. And so Atlantis never had the continental crust that I described earlier. It didn't have it, and Atlantis was always short of metals. It was always short of the variety of metals that were needed to sustain such a lovely culture and such an immense civilization. We'll see where she got her metals from in a moment. Therefore, from our point of view, there's no point in searching for a granitic layer to Atlantis. There never was one. The layer that was there, the basaltic layer, rose above the level of the sea. It weathered. It was punctured by volcanoes, and they weathered. And so we had a huge low-lying subcontinent, with these immense volcanic mountains perforating them in the middle. I said that it was something smaller than Australia. The terrain was subtropical, not unlike the flat portions of South Sea Islands, punctuated by volcanic hills. There were extensive shallow seas that rose and submerged as the ocean bed of the subcontinent constantly moved, splitting apart and reforming. Mangrove swamps, natural harbors, many islands, sand dunes, these were the main characteristics of the lowlands. They provided natural harbors and lagoons that made Atlantis a maritime race. The volcanic areas were only thinly populated. The high areas, way up, which are the Azores today, were only thinly populated. Alternations in the level of the land above sea level were frequent, as were inundations. During settled periods, populations spread quickly and forgot the cataclysms that so often rent the unstable continent, which was as big as Australia. Atlantis was never part of a bridge between Europe and America. This is one of the old arguments, that how is it possible that you get animals here that are like animals there? And the argument was that there was a land bridge. There was a land bridge here, which was the southern part of Atlantis. And so the animals were able to move across. And today, of course, that argument falls away with the drift of continents, and it is the suggestion now that there was never any land bridges at all, and that the continents fitted into each other. Thus South America fitted snugly into Africa there, and that was when the animals moved across something like 200 million years ago. Now, let me just continue. The climate was Hawaiian, profiting from the Gulf Stream. Britain and Europe were far less accessible to the Gulf Stream because of Atlantis, and their civilizations were stunted because of the huge oscillations in climate. While Europe was then covered in glaciers and ice sheets, Atlantis was mild. This is the reason why we haven't got any great civilization remnants in Europe. Only Stone Age men who were not worthy of populating Atlantis. Atlantis had the main population. This was the fringe of Atlantis. It was cold. The oscillations of temperature were immense. Here was the Gulf Stream cut off from Europe. One can't imagine what Europe would be like today without the Gulf Stream keeping it mild and warm. Atlantis absorbed all the Gulf Stream, and it was the main center of populations. Only the more primitive tribes were thrust up into the periphery in regions that were hostile to live in. The Atlanteans, on the other hand, colonized all the areas around the oceans that fringed on Atlantis. For a long, long time, for instance, North Africa was covered with water. North Africa was covered with a sheet of water, and when I was on maneuvers in the Sinai Desert during the World War, I remember on mountaintops finding whole layers and layers of seashells. And this whole area was covered with water, and the Atlanteans colonized all these regions, and the first colonies of Egypt were Atlantean. The boat sailed across the desert, which is desert today. It was then a shallow sea, and it was then about 70,000 years ago that the Great Pyramid of Egypt, the Great Pyramid itself, was built, about 70 to 75,000 years ago. For this was a colony of Atlantis. So was that. Atlantis was able to draw her metals, especially gold, from South America. This explains why we have pyramids there and we have pyramids here. They were all part of the colonies of Atlantis. And Atlantis was reached very easily by water. The seas were never like they are today. They were mild, and the water was warm, of course. Atlantis had few natural resources and was sustained by products from her huge colonies that bordered both sides of the Atlantic, extending across the shallow seas of North Africa as far as Egypt in the east and South America in the west. Much of Atlantis oscillated between low-lying land just above sea level and shallow seas. Were Iceland placed in the tropics amidst very shallow seas, it would soon become the center of a land mass, not unlike that described above, yet always subject to upheavals and volcanic action as it is today. Each decade sees great alterations to Iceland's coastline. After the destruction of Atlantis, Atlantean colonies in the Middle East became the next cradles of civilization. Naturally they would. With the mainland gone, and with the colonizers planted in South America and on the coast of Egypt and elsewhere, naturally that would be where new races, new civilizations would develop, and they did, of course. The melting of the ice sheets all over the world affected the level of the seas and the shape of the Atlantis continent too. Most of Atlantis is now about 1 mile below the Atlantic surface. It would be tempting to suggest that the melting of the ice sheets of the European continent and the continual rise of areas like Scandinavia, which is still rising today, contributed to the progressive submerging of Atlantis, which submerging was by stages and occupied immense periods of time. But the occult tradition remains, namely, that the island was destroyed by earthquakes and volcanoes. The contorted and uneven surface of the ocean bed in the mid-Atlantic Ocean along a line drawn between Gibraltar and Martha's Vineyard, Massachusetts, confirms it. In other words, if you take a line drawn from there to there on the floor of the ocean, then you find this effect. Starting with Martha's Vineyard, there is this effect. and you get this mid-Atlantic crest like that, and it tapers off towards Africa. This is the picture that has been picked up by underwater soundings only a few years ago, and it of course can be easily examined. I see no reason to retreat from the basic occult proposition outlined above. What we need to know is whether the seafloor indicated, that's at the bottom of the Atlantic, at any time has been in contact with atmospheric oxygen. That's what we want to know. If an Atlantis was there, then we want to know, is any of the material lying on the floor of the Atlantic Ocean, has it ever been in contact with oxygen? If it has, with atmospheric oxygen, then it would show it. But whilst science searches for something entirely different from a lost continent, it's not likely to uncover evidence confirming it. As I always say, when people say, well, why haven't they found the huge human remains that you talk about? If men were 12 feet and 14 feet tall in the dim past, why do we not find human bones, immense bones, thigh bones like that? The answer is, of course, because we're not looking for them. And if we found a thigh bone that size, we would think it was belonging to some reptile, some creature of that order. And if you're not looking for something, you don't usually find it. You don't usually find it. And they're not looking for a lost continent of Atlantis. They're sounding the ocean floor beds. If they were looking for a continent of Atlantis, they would soon find evidence for it. Continental drift and the emergence of new rock on the seabed does not rule out shallow seas and their temporary companionship with islands and volcanoes. On the contrary, they seem to confirm it. Those speculations of occultists, now proved false, about the extent, the shape, and the substance of Atlantis do not invalidate the basic proposition that Atlantis did exist. There is very good evidence that the whole of the Sahara and the Suez area were covered by shallow seas not so long ago. I've seen it myself. If the age-old drifting continents can now be covered with water and then be laid bare, why should not the exuberant new rock of a mid-Atlantic ridge break through the seas and show itself for a brief period of a few million years, giving birth to the great race of Atlantis? Now, the reason why I tortured you going through that paper was that this individual who was investigating Atlantis was so struck by the logic of the arguments that I had put here, and I had gained that information almost entirely from occult research, that he sent my paper to a graduate, a very famous professor in the subject at Cambridge University. And this was what that professor had to say about my argument. He said this: "From my limited knowledge of Atlantic geology, I think it is fair to say that everything in the account, which I've just read to you, is plausible, in particular with regard to the volcanic origin of Atlantis." Now, we've always said that. We've always said consistently again and again and again that Atlantis was of volcanic origin, and that it was volcanoes and earthquakes that destroyed it. And so he, despite these theories, of which he's very au fait, being a university lecturer at Cambridge University, he says, "From my limited knowledge of Atlantic geology, I think it is fair to say that everything in the account is plausible, in particular with regard to the volcanic origin of Atlantis. Whoever communicated this message to your occultist friend has done his homework. Iceland is currently seen as an anomalously high part of the mid-Atlantic ridge, and there is really no reason why there should not have been other such areas in the past." Now, that is for you to examine any time you wish. What I am saying here this afternoon is this: because you feel a few drops of rainwater, it doesn't mean that there's a monsoon. Because science makes a few recent discoveries and is agog, it doesn't mean to say that we have to alter our standpoint, which is thousands of years old, that there was an Atlantis, that it was unstable, that it was of volcanic origin, and that it did disappear below the waves, and that is our contention still. I must remind you that long before ocean boats could measure the magnetic fields of the ocean bed floor, Madame Blavatsky said this, that the North Pole had changed many, many times, that there had been changes in the position of the North Pole, and that the Earth's magnetic field had reversed itself several times. And that is the contention of science today, exactly that contention. So that when they measure with magnetic devices the various materials on the floor of the ocean, these anomalies, these strange factors emerge. Not only that the magnetic field of the Earth, its North Pole has moved around, but there has been reversals of the Earth's magnetic field. And that was given out by Blavatsky in the 1880s. In the 1880s. And you can read about it, of course, in the Secret Doctrine. So there is my contention that this basaltic layer, being heaved up from the middle of the Atlantic, occasionally rose above the surface of the ocean. It was perforated by volcanic upheavals, and these weathered and produced the low-lying flat areas just above the seabed, into which we used to sail our ships and rest in a continent that we all loved. And when things changed, it didn't matter very much. There were lots of other low-lying areas. The maritime race was always being subjected to population disasters, and they didn't worry very much at all. So there is the rough contention about Atlantis, and I would be happy to answer some questions now, because it would be unfair to put this proposition to you without giving some answers to questions. There is no granitic layer under Iceland. Iceland is volcanic. And so the reason why I kept referring to Iceland was because, A, it's part of the mid-Atlantic ridge that Atlantis was, and that its structure is volcanic, and we can see in front of our eyes bits of land coming up and being weathered and occasionally populated, and then in many instances sinking. Long before all this modern scientific view was presented, a little group of people banded themselves together in England and called themselves still to this day the Atlanteans. And it was their proposition that in the years before the end of the century, I believe that's their prophecy, that a part of Atlantis would be thrown up again. And so we say that whilst we agree that the continental drift idea is probable, that the continents themselves separated, we all say that there is vertical and downward movement of the Earth's surface, and that this produced Atlantis, a pushing up of the basaltic layer above the sea for a short period of several million years. Yes, Connie.
Why did not they go into North America and build the pyramids and have a culture there, such as we find in Mexico and Egypt?
Well, you have to remember that Florida barely existed at all. It's damned unstable today, and it hardly existed at all, and that the ocean swept right in here. This was a huge, shallow sea.
Stuff like Massachusetts and New England and
Look at the latitude. The latitude is very high. Why did people who hadn't got electricity and things like that want the hell to live up? They pushed the primitive tribes up there. This is where Atlantis thrived, was around here. There were certain regions here, and I believe from our Phoenix Festival, we had a young man there who maintained that there were many Atlantean remnants deposited in the flat areas of Arizona. Of course, you must remember this inland sea was very like the one in North Africa, and that it was a place millions of years ago that the dinosaurs thrived in, the lovely shallow seas.
I've read or heard that. They developed the Atlantean Sea way back in.
Well, I'm not going into all the far-fetched, some of them true, ideas about the Atlantis culture. My talk this afternoon is really about the subject of whether Atlantis actually existed and the views today of science that the continents drifted apart. In fact, the continental drift idea is irrelevant, except for this, that the continents, according to science, have always had the granitic layer, and that the seabeds have never had a granitic layer. And this is supposed to act against the concept of Atlantis. If you think of Atlantis as being like this continent, or like Europe, then of course that is not what the teaching shows, and not what my occult research shows. It shows that the land that was lived upon in Atlantis was generally very flat. There were hills, there were volcanic deposits, and so on, and they were high. But the main area of Atlantis was flat. It was very much like the South Sea Islands. Yes, Annabelle. Speak up. Still can't hear you.
Trying to get two specific things between the cruise lines. Could you identify where the present island of Bermuda is in relation to that?
Well, I would have to ask Kitty that, but I think I can make a quick reference to. I can make a guess. I think Bermuda is just about here. Now you're bringing in Edgar Casey. You're bringing in the research work done here, which shows that there are immense slabs of material indicating that there has been a civilization or a culture of Bimini, was it? Bimini. I don't want to go into that tonight. I want to impress upon you, I am at this stage not an expert on Atlantis. I was provoked by somebody to go into this matter, and I've answered it. And if you asked me all about the cultures there in detail, I couldn't tell you. I don't know.
Your concept, did you say that the drift of the continent was a process due to your basaltic layer coming up through this rift, forcing the continents apart, or after the continent parted, your basaltic came up to fill the injury?
It is the scientific teaching that it was the continuous outpouring from the center of the earth, this flow that parted and pushed them apart like that, and they virtually moved with it, and there is a suggestion that they float. I know these words seem incredible to us. They were incredible to the Victorians. But we've got to give scientific view, and there is very good evidence that the continents have drifted. But most of the drift, as far as we're concerned, was all over by the time Atlantis was founded. Atlantis was a movement of the mid-Atlantic ridge upwards. The ridge was there after the continents had separated. The main reaction to the occult is that if Atlantis was a continent and it was torn to pieces, this should show itself in here. And my answer to that is nonsense. That if you have got a huge area like the subcontinent of Atlantis, practically parts of it sinking almost overnight, there is no reason why that Atlantean subcontinent should fall that way, or fall that way, or twist. Why shouldn't this go straight down? And the magnetic field be almost continuous. In fact, when we examine the magnetic lines that have been tested, we find that regions around the Azores haven't been investigated for various reasons, because, for instance, they're volcanic. And a lot has to be learned. The main purpose of my talk this afternoon was to say to you again that don't budge, don't shift, don't enter into a frantic Dunkirk merely because science is shifting ground. Many people in the esoteric world, especially in theosophical circles, are scientists, and they have a science group there, and I hate the attitude of the thing. Why haven't they reprinted by Janaraja Dasa? Or is it because there is a whole string of racial types there, stretching from ancient Lemurians right through to advanced Aryans? Is it a fear that the ancient wisdom would be regarded as racist? I can't think of any reason why they would hold back the printing of first principles of theosophy, except for the fact that there are a few old maps there which would show up the fact that many of the clairvoyant observations were wrong. The basic one was that there was a continent, a subcontinent in the mid-Atlantic area, and that it cradled the civilization that gave us all our solar plexus chakras. Sometimes we feel hostile towards it because of that fact. Question, one more. Lois, you'll get to ask the question.
Same one.
Same one. All right.
Has there been any digs or anything in the Azores to see if there's any remnants?
Digs in the Azores. You have to remember, of course, that the Azores in the time of Atlantis were up here. Here's the top of the mountain. There's the volcanic region. And here was the main part of Atlantis, and there was the sea. The low-lying area was occupied by the masses of people, and even if people did live on the hills, here's the ocean today, there's a mile difference between. Even if they did live up here in those early days, it's hardly likely that they would cast immense cultural structures up mountainsides and leave them there. I wouldn't have expected evidence of a full culture in the Azores. This is where we really need to explore this region below the Atlantic, where some say, flying over in planes, they have seen temples below the water. Unusual angles of looking into the water have revealed huge slabs and things like that. This is a tradition that still exists. It's a fascinating subject. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I have come to the end of my duties here this weekend, and I want to thank you. I know we're going to have a festival closure in a moment, but I want to thank you personally for the wonderful courtesy and attention you've given some of the very outrageous propositions which I have put here this weekend. Thank you.